Hello and welcome to the Mind Body Soil podcast, a podcast where we explore the innate connection between the mind, the body and the soil. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Smartsoil. Smartsoil is an online education platform creating courses and providing resources from farmers for farmers. Join us as we share the stories and experiences from those dedicated to regenerating ecosystems, communities and human beings. Alrighty, episode 11 of the Mind Body Soil podcast. We are with Rowan Reid from Bamborough Agroforestry, or is it Agroforestry Farm? However we want to.
Forestry Farm.
How it is, yes, it is. Been a fan of Rowan's work for a long time. Love his book. I'm sure we'll give it a good plug throughout this podcast, but make sure you get your hands on it, and we'll put a link to that book in the show notes. So yeah, get round Rowan's work. It's really inspirational, and I think it's going to have a huge impact on Australian farms and internationally. So thanks for being with us today, Rowan.
Thanks, David. That's great. Yep.
Fantastic. Hey, mate, I'd like to start the podcast and just position us, but I like to just recall an impactful moment from your journey. It's something that just sort of got you thinking outside the box and perhaps doing things a little bit differently.
Oh, well, the biggest moment in my little agroforestry life was after backpacking in Europe, after studying forestry for about 6 or so years. Claire and I went backpacking in Europe and then down into Africa. And in Kenya, that's when I met up with my mother, and she told me she'd sold the old family farm and asked me one simple question. Have you got something you'd like to do with farmland? And I got the break that every 25-year-old would love. The opportunity to just buy just 100 acres when I was 25, just to give this shot a go. And I wanted to, what I said to her in that response was something to the effect, I want to do forestry the way it's never been done in Australia. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but I need some land to do it. Otherwise, I can't tell other people what it's about. And that's what happened back in 1987.
Wow. So you've been on that. So you're still on that country today?
Yeah, this is the block. So 100 acres we purchased in 1987. It was part of an ex-dairy farm. There were no buildings on it. There was just one internal fence. And so, as everyone said, a clean slate with a eroded creek running through the middle. And so we made that the basis for all our work, which takes us right around the world. Yep.
So the land was quite flogged then and in a state of disrepair. Well, some would say disrepair, but you've managed to turn this place around, right?
Well, I've grown a lot of trees and tried to slow the erosion, and certainly made it better for sheep shelter. We've got lambing happening here at the moment. So it's certainly very different than it was, and I like it. I like what I've learned from doing it, and that's probably the most exciting part.
Yeah, such a good point. So what sort of vegetative cover are you sitting at now, and what was it when you got there?
Well, so 2/3 of the 100 acres had no trees on it at all, and so the rest was a scattering of regrowth native forests that came up after the last war. From my judgment, I've seen photos. It was all cleared 100 years ago. Just probably. Post Second World War, the housing boom, employment was good. It was pretty hard to get people or family members to go and grub out a few eucalypts, so they tended to come back on the steep sections. I make a point of highlighting that to visitors, because when people see a big old eucalypt, they seem to start saying that must be 300 or 400 years old. And it's quite extraordinary how fast in terms of diameter, you can grow a tree. And you look at these trees, and it's clear to me that they never grew in a forest. So I've been trying to highlight the opportunity. You can make trees grow very quickly in diameter. I keep saying in diameter rather than height. Height's a bit more difficult, but we can achieve, if we manage it, some really nice looking trees in a good short period of time. So that's what we've got now. Probably at least, well, the stocking rate varies of trees all over the place, from parklands to dense plantings to corridors to shelter belts to little blocks. It's very varied, but at least half the property is now under a good 50% tree canopy, and that certainly changes the landscape.
Yeah, and I imagine the microclimate as well. You're probably creating. I mean, you'd almost be creating rainfall with that sort of cover. That's Spectacular.
Yeah,
And
if I had a few thousand hectares of it, it might do, but not
well,
on a
hey
small
mate,
scale.
keep at it.
Yeah.
You might inspire enough people, hopefully, to get on the train. So, and so you're not. It's a bit different because it's not exclusively trees, is it, Rowan? You're still running animals underneath the
Yeah,
canopies, or
yeah, Claire and I owned sheep for the first what might have been 15 to 20 years, but since then the neighbours runs the sheep on the property because I travel so much, and so she runs it on her farm and our farm, and like I said, lambing at the moment. So she brings them here for lambing because it's so sheltered, and so that works really well. And I need the agricultural component uh, as well as a little bit of adjustment money. It's the fire control, weed control, and aesthetics. I find the grazing really helps with the management, uh, certainly in weeds and fire risk. But I actually find it's aesthetically much more pleasing to have areas of grazing under trees. And it reduces your uncertainty and your risk factors, particularly as you go into summer.
yeah.
And that's really important. In our we're in a very, very high risk fire region in Australia. It's equivalent to that southwest WA area around Bridgetown, where a good friend of mine got burnt out, and keep planting trees. But on our side, we're in the dangerous area, the foothills forests, southeastern Australia, messmate and other stringy bark eucalypts surrounding us. It's an extremely dangerous area. So anything I can do to reduce that risk in terms of grazing, but also in tree selection and management. So a lot of our management's focused on getting a high quality tree for a range of different products, but also to make it a lower risk should a fire come during that period.
Can we just unpack that a little bit, Rowan, about your tree selection and how that can have an impact on lowering your risk?
Yeah, well, yeah, everyone's familiar with the idea that, or the concept that eucalypts have eucalyptus oil, and a lot of them have stringy bark, and come a fire, they throw a lot of spots, burning embers in because those leaves burn for a longer period of time than most species. And tea trees for other ones grow naturally here. I don't promote them at all because they're highly flammable. So where we do have eucalypts, but even the eucalypts, we space them and prune them for timber production, and that increases the distance from the ground vegetation, which is grazed, up to the canopy, and breaking it means that the fire has got less chance of turning to a crown fire. And so in those areas, but we try and, if it's a stringy bark, we plant it on the eastern side rather than the northwestern side of our assets. But you come closer to the house where I am now, and all to the north and west, we plant oak trees. A lot of oak trees and other deciduous trees to try and reduce that risk. During the big fires in the eastern states, I've seen houses effectively, from my interpretation, protected by poplars and oak trees. So I've got no qualms about growing those. But again, I'll grow them all for high value timber. So just thinking about the location, but any species is a risk in a way, so you manage it by pruning and spacing, grazing, and you can actually reduce that risk around your assets. Further away from the house and to the southeastern side, we won't get a fire from the southeast, or not a dangerous one anyway, because it's always a humid wind. And that's where I have the areas of native forest and understory and more dense plantings. And
Wow.
I should probably think about my neighbours to the southeast, but there's not too many of those that I'm making life worse for. So thinking about where you are, our houses and sheds are right in the middle of the farm, so I can manage all that land around it. So my fire sector, if you like, is to the north and the west, and I look at the long-term weather forecast, and I'm already thinking about possibly setting up some new fencing and grazing heavily to the north and west if we really do go into this predicted drought that we're talking about for next season.
Yeah, it's on everyone's mind at the moment. I think seems to be either too much water or not enough. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. And I imagine that you're building a better soil profile anyway with these deep rooted trees, and you're probably holding that water a lot better in the landscape. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yeah, no, I'm learning quite a bit about how trees differ, and soil types are important for that. If you take eucalypts, for example, they where you don't have, if you have too many eucalypts that you can't have a ground cover there, or if they're, we don't do any set stocking, but if they're grazed to the point of having bare soil under eucalypts, that's not real good. You know, that you get a lot of soil erosion under the eucalypts when they're either too dense or you've got no ground cover. So managing the ground cover is important to do that. Having the stock means that any leaf litter is turned over a bit quicker because you've got nitrogen in the system. They do eat some of the foliage, less of the eucalypts, but certainly the acacias and most of the other species, they'll utilize that. That turnover improves the soil. But the good thing about, the essential thing about trees, the ones that have very fibrous root systems or are able to explore deeper into the root profile that your pastures can't, can effectively do what pastures do. They can grow, die back continually every year, and therefore add organic matter deeper into the profile. And now pastures can do that, which is why a lot of you get a lot of black soil under good pasture management, a lot of organic matter in that. In trees, it's a little bit more variable. In some of the native trees, you'll actually turn black pasture soils into brown clays because you'll actually get less organic matter in the soil, but more in the plant material that's in the ground, the root systems. But we have another species we grow particularly for soil management, which is the coast redwood. And that's because it can grow in our sodic clays. These are clays with a very high sodium content. Pastures can't go into that sodic clay subsoil, but the tree roots can, and they work the soil under the ground. And I effectively say they lime the soil from below because they're able to, by their root growth and their respiration, break down the inert calcite that's in our clays, release the calcium, and effectively lime the soils. But other species of tree won't even grow into those soils. So to actually enhance soil profiles, you need to find a tree that will grow deep into that profile, particularly with its fine roots. And many trees won't actually do that. They'll only send large taproots down. So there's a lot happening below the ground, but it varies on all the different soil types and for different species. But I'm pretty keen on any of the acacias. They have a really good soil build up under them. Casuarinas are pretty good. And then in the exotics, both the oaks and the poplars, in the deciduous introduced species and the redwoods particularly, they really work the soil. I've never seen a species work the clay so hard to make it black and rich. They're quite extraordinary.
And a beautiful timber, right?
Yeah, well, that's what, the idea is that the tree is doing a lot of good below ground, protecting the soil and reducing that sodic soil erosion we have. But above ground, you're growing a high value timber, which is a beautiful and attractive tree that's fun to grow for a long period of time. So that doesn't matter. So now our trees are 35. Well, we're actually, one of our biggest redwoods is just 2 centimeters off being a meter in diameter. And we planted that. A meter in diameter is pretty big. And I've got 1 or 2 eucalypts that are approaching that figure. But come this spring, we will, it'll be exactly 36 years since planting. We will hit the 1 meter diameter tree. And it's quite great in terms of thinking that we can drive growth in diameter so well by managing the competition in a forest. You'll never achieve that in a native forest or an unmanaged plantation because there's just too many trees. But if you reduce the tree stocking, direct all the growth into less stems, you can do extraordinary things. And that's really part of the reason we bought the farm, or I set it up, because I wanted to explore these boundaries of forestry and tree growth a bit more. People have soil erosion problems, and the answer is just plant native trees. And I'm saying, well, there's a lot of different trees in the world, and there's a lot of reasons why the natives aren't going to solve this problem. I think we need more science in there. So it gave me a chance to do things like I just described, tackle soil erosion problems with an exotic species. And the other thing I wanted to push the boundaries of in both forestry and conservation plantings and to explore and now show that it's viable, that the act of cutting down trees for profit, harvesting trees as we do regularly now, can actually be done in a way that enhances conservation outcomes. And I believe we're showing by harvesting trees, we can drive succession in forests to move them into a more mature or more advanced state, getting mature forests in 30 years rather than 80 years. And we can actually introduce a lot of ecological processes, dead stumps, wood lying on the ground, standing dead trees, all this biomass that you're putting into the system. If you don't have too much, you don't overwhelm it and increase the risks and the problems and have debris running down your waterways. But if you have enough, you're actually able to start driving these ecological processes. So this farm was set up to give me the confidence to describe those things and interpret them and do the research, but to show others that if people are just planting local native species for conservation and thinking they're doing a wonderful job, well, they're going to be missing a lot of opportunities to provide biodiversity, enhance soils, and develop, lock up carbon and a whole lot of the conservation values. And if you're only planting trees for profit and planting blocks of Pinus radiata or blue gum wood chips or anything around the world, if you're only doing that, you're missing the opportunity to create these forests that provide biodiversity, are much more attractive, are fun to own and beautiful to own. And so there's all that space in between trees grown just for production and trees grown just for conservation that I think most landholders, when they see it, they say, well, it's just common sense. If I'm going to fence out a creek, why can't I grow some timber in there as well, rather than just see it as a conservation planting?
Yes.
And I guess I'm excited because we've got hundreds of farmers in our area now who approach their plantings in that way and don't just try to say, well, that's my conservation area over there, that's my production area over there. Yeah, they're pushing the boundaries and say, how can we marry those together? And I think the more excited they are, the more they share their experience, and the more satisfied they are, the more trees they'll grow. So I think with all the landholders making decisions on land management around Australia and around the world, they need the knowledge and confidence to do things that they want to do. That's all we're trying to explore.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Rowan. So much to unpack there and so many tangents we could go down. But before we do, I'd just like to just gather a bit more about your background and sort of where you're coming from, your context. Because that's quite you're obviously an innovator and you're thinking outside the box to think about those overlaps in systems and where you can find productivity and, not just conservation. They're not mutually exclusive. So, you're a forestry background. Is that correct?
It's funny you said think outside the box. It occurred to me last week that maybe I've already lived outside the box. And I've always enjoyed from when I was a teenager, and I suppose it was the 70s and I was surfing, so I didn't want to conform to anything. And I have a bit of a mistrust in people who tell you that they've got the answer to everything and you've just got to copy what they do. And I certainly don't have the confidence to tell anyone I know what they should do on their property. I just try to give them the science and practice to give it a go. So I approached, I studied forest science because I thought it might be a good way to live down the Great Ocean Road and go surfing all the time. It was outside the city and there was lots of forest in the area. But my brother was actually a dairy farmer at the time, and it seemed very natural for me to want to explore how forestry could be a friend to farmers, because in that dairy farming region, forestry was always seen as a threat. Big forestry companies were buying whole farms and planting them to pine plantations. They were selling the house or putting it up for rent, and it was just a loss of community. And I'm visiting this community of dairy farmers every weekend while I'm studying forestry, and I'm thinking, they don't like what they think forestry is, but I'm really passionate about what forestry could be. So it was right from that first year of my forest science degree that I decided I wanted to work in the agricultural landscape. We've had some big issues in the native forest on public land recently, And people have continually asked me what my opinion about locking up the forest and whether native forestry logging is a good thing. Back then, I decided I wouldn't participate in that debate 40 years ago because everyone had an opinion and no one was listening to anyone else. And because it was run by politicians, I doubted whether good science would ever be the driver of how we did the forestry logging or where we did it. And what I saw unfold was 30 years of the forestry wars. And I'm glad I was in the agricultural landscape because the forestry wars haven't led us to any particular answers or opportunities. And so both in West Australia, Victoria now, they've closed native forest logging. Maybe that's what they had to do before we can start exploring some positive ways to manage our landscape. Yes. But in the farming landscape, almost every farm needs some trees just to be a better farm. It might be 5% of the farm, or just the eroded gullies, or just the unproductive areas. And therein lies a great opportunity if we could have forestry, the production of profit, commercial trees, on the land that farmers wanted to plant trees on, then the forestry wouldn't have to pay for the land. It wouldn't be competing for the land. It would actually be the answer to their problems. And that would be a much more healthy landscape for me to work professionally. And also the impact could be enormous on what I see as the biggest land degradation or the biggest conservation issue other than climate change in rural Australia is the degradation of farmland and the loss of carbon and biodiversity out of our farmland. You know, I wonder why the conservation issues have been focused on the native forest when the biggest issue is on the farmland. So that's where I wanted to work. I decided that very early on, and then went on and studied what you might call agroforestry, or what we thought agroforestry might be back in the 80s. And then in the 90s, just after we bought this farm, I started lecturing at university, the first subject in Australia on agroforestry, just trees on farms, really, for agriculture and forestry students. And that's been going since 1991, although I left the university 12 years ago now. But I go back and just teach just this subject. So it's always been my interest to do something with forestry in an agricultural landscape. And what that means is there wasn't many of us doing it. And when I team up with some farmers that are now very, very good friends of mine, it's easy to work with them and just explore and assist people. And then what you can achieve, I think, is much more satisfying. So that's where it all came from. And that's been my focus ever since.
Amazing. And how are you seeing that conversation change, Rowan? And you know, is it still seen as a threat, the forestry style, or when you're approaching it the way you do? I mean, are you seeing them sort of listen a bit more, or?
Yes, forestry. You know, the people in Australia, we had a. If you got some of the audience overseas, but in Australia during, 15, 20 years ago, we had a tax avoidance program that was driven by forestry on farms, and it effectively became a huge, we call the managed investment schemes. Wealthy people in the cities put money into forestry. Companies took that money, purchased farms, put it all under trees, and forestry was a threat to agriculture. It was a threat to rural communities once again. I'd seen it during the pines in the 80s. It came back in the late 90s. And I think farmers are rightly pretty pissed off with the way forestry has been done in Australia in the agricultural landscape, because they want trees, but they don't want that many, and they don't want them all of the one type for the one product. So there has been that missed opportunity. In our area, there was some purchase of farmland by forestry companies, but fortunately, in some ways, our land prices were a little bit too high. In our area, because we'd work with farmers, they started exploring revegetation on their terms and doing tree growing on their terms. So we have had large scale landscape change from areas about 4 or 5% tree cover in the early 90s up to 20%. And I think at that 20%, people are quite comfortable with forestry in their landscape. It's when it starts going bigger than that it starts being perceived as a threat, particularly if the money's coming directly from government or companies. If they see their neighbour put trees in, they're quite comfortable with them. I don't think anyone's complaining about my tree cover here because I'm not likely to go and buy every farm in the district and put it under a big block of pines and move to the city. But that's been happening, and that's seen as a threat. And it's still a threat because the carbon market is at risk of driving exactly the same negative outcomes, because big companies will see the opportunity for carbon just to justify buy some land, plant the trees, and walk away. So forestry is still just on the cusp of going negative again. And I still want people to have the language and confidence to say, not just reject forestry because of the threats they see, but to say, we want forestry, but we want it done on the terms of our community and the way we would like to see it, and negotiate that more effectively. But governments are all about carbon plantations now, and I'm worried about that. But any single purpose planting is quite dangerous, particularly if it's driven by artificial markets. Like our carbon market's pretty artificial. Our tax market was very artificial, and large government grants, they're very artificial as well. These can have big negative consequences. But I still remain very optimistic about what forestry can do, and I see very good stuff both in Western Australia, Victoria, and around the country, and where farmers have got the confidence to show alternative ways of doing it.
Absolutely, Rowan, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because I'm sort of seeing the same thing happen with these huge purchases of stations, and then the plan to put it into monoculture trees, turn it into an ecological desert essentially, and for that biodiversity and what you mentioned, and leave the land in worse nick. It's scary to see. So I'm really interested in zooming on that part you said about forestry on your own terms, or as a farmer. So if a farmer is thinking, great, that sounds awesome. I mean, what sort of tips would you have in setting up some of that forestry on their terms, and where do they start?
Well, the simplest way to start, if anyone's involved in whatever type of farming they're in, whether if you're a dairy farmer, you're thinking about stock movement and paddock planning. If you're doing regen farming, you're talking about stock movement around the farm, rotational grazing. Any sort of effective agricultural management planning is actually going to highlight where on the farm you don't want to have agriculture, whether it's no cropping or no grazing. And that might be, as I said, 5% of the farm, because it's highly erodible. It's because it's too wet or it's too rocky. And they're the areas that become free for tree growing, because if they're not with trees, they're probably full of weeds or other problems that require management. So the simplest way for landholders to go is think about how tree growing can complement their current system without increasing risk. And this is a big problem with conventional forestry. If a landholder takes 20 hectare paddock out of production and puts it in forestry, all they've done on their farm, if they're only interested in timber, is increase their risk, because they've got to learn a new skill. They've got to find new markets. They're now at risk of losing timber markets as well as farming markets, and they're at risk of all sorts of disease and fire in their forestry. Whereas if they plant the trees primarily for shelter or land degradation, the risk is low because they can get those benefits quite easily. And if they manage those trees and think about the management for timber, well, the timber will be seen as a bonus. And the positive of that is it doesn't really matter how long it takes to grow. I'm a bit worried now that we're harvesting, trees over 30, and as I said, quite large trees. People are going to, again, think if they visit here, it takes a long time. But most of us, in terms of agriculture, are managing our farms for at least a generation, whether that's 30 years or 40 years. And that's a great opportunity to start planting trees and then create some really beautiful asset, a capital asset, a farm. Well-treed farm might be the quote on the sales board if you have to sell it. Yeah. A well-treed farm might be just the farm that attracts your children to come back and live and work in the region, whether they're involved in agriculture or not. So I see the time it takes trees to grow to produce a profit is a long time, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't fit with the short and medium term goals of farming. And that's when you want to make those work. So the starting point is make sure you get the short, medium term goals, make sure you're not creating more risk and uncertainty on the farm, and then enjoy the learning. Enjoy learning from other tree growers in your area. Enjoy the management and watching the change. Enjoy seeing the wildlife come back. We've had some great wildlife come back. A lot of sugar gliders now, and antechinus, and we have a Ricali, a water rat in the eastern states here, and even that. And these species you wouldn't have in just a pasture environment. So your tree growing has actually enhanced that, as well as the 20 or 30 bird species, like tree creepers, and you don't get those unless you've got trees. So you're doing something positive for the landscape when you see this wildlife come back. And that's pretty satisfying, because you feel like you're on a positive trajectory rather than watching your land degrade. And whether you're farming or getting off farm income, if you own land, seeing that positive change, it's likely that other people will see that as well, and your farm will be more attractive, more valuable, and a more enjoyable asset for future generations.
Yeah, beautiful, Rowan. And that sort of highlights a part of, I guess, what this podcast initially set out to do was create some dialogue around that mindset. And, we met a lot of farmers that are not necessarily happy doing what they're doing, and probably because they're not getting those outcomes that you mentioned there about, they're not walking around looking at the place and it's getting more beautiful and more biodiverse. It's actually degrading. So how much of a part has that played in your sort of setting up the farm, and how rewarding is it now for you as you walk around the farm? And I bet it fills you up.
Well, it does. It's a great way to start the dogs to start the day by taking the dogs for a run through the trees, try to get them inside before the snakes come out. And that's my son's a vet, and you hear how many dogs get bitten by snakes. So try to get them in and out so they're exhausted. And so you go for a walk around the trees and through the different parts of the farm, and it is really satisfying. But more importantly, is you're learning every time you do that, because you're looking at trees, and it's the same with pastures, isn't it? They change through the season. So you're seeing them regularly, and you're noticing new changes. You probably take a bit of plastic tape and mark some trees that you've got to go back to and do some work on them because they need a bit of pruning or correction, or some trees damaged, and you think you might take that one out. But regularly being in your forest or on your farm, I say forest, it's more like a parkland on our property. It is extraordinarily satisfying. And so, it must be depressing if you're in a landscape that the erosion gullies are getting worse and the salinity is spreading through the landscape, and you keep putting on some sort of supplements onto your pasture, but you keep needing more. And so it must be quite depressing. But in forests, trees get bigger, and you get the joy of seeing results of work you did 20, 30 years ago, which you certainly don't see if you're working in a paddock of annual crops.
Yeah. And so is there opportunities then for sort of short-term monetary feedback? So I'm just thinking for farmers, and probably a better question to ask you would be, what sort of pushback do you get most regularly from farmers when you're proposing that they plant more trees in this way? And then we could then say, well, make up what they might say. Because I was just thinking that, some of them will be like, well, I was thinking, well, they're going to want a return on their investment. They've got bills to pay, et cetera, et cetera. So they want something back in that short term. So is there ways to sort of work around that, or is it just setting it up for that long term, or is it, like you said, having more than one use for every tree?
Well, that's the key. I used to do a talk about I do a regular talk about the economics of tree growing, and I say there's no money in it. If what you're talking about is getting an income that you can actually put food on the table, send the kids to school, or go on a holiday, you can't do that if you don't have mature trees. So it's not about income. It's about building wealth and capital over a period of time. It's a little bit like renovating your house. If you renovate in a way that you enjoy living in that house, well, you've enhanced the capital, but you also get the ongoing benefit of utilizing that. Conventional forestry, this will probably get me in trouble with some of the conventional foresters, but I look at the people advocating it, and they're all on a salary. But none of them have to wait. And I think, well, just you guys, imagine you had to plant these trees and wait 30 years for the trees to grow before you got a financial return from those trees. And all that 30 years, every summer you're worried about fire, every winter you're worried about a flood, and then there's all the disease risks, and you don't even know if the sawmill's still going to be around, even if it's just up the road. It'll probably be sold and moved on. Or the government will shut it down, as they did to all the native forest sawmills in area. And so my starting point is often with landholders is, the risks of trying to make money out of planting trees now that take 30 years to grow. I'm not suggesting anyone does that. And as I said before, but if you're planting trees for another reason, why don't you, for a small extra bit of work, keep that option open of getting a commercial return in the future? And you really don't know what the future holds. So to give people an example, we planted pine trees and managed them. And the local pine mill said, "Oh, you're too small. You're 3 hectares of trees. They're not big enough for us. Probably keep the mill going for about an hour and a half, just all our trees. And we don't want to cut them all down at once anyway." But then we decided to double the size of the farmhouse, and COVID hit. And I go up to the top paddock. I fell a tree. I put it on the little sawmill, mill it up. It's all labor intensive. I dry the timber, and then I come back and do a little, assessment on how much money I've saved, because I can't buy the framing timber because it wasn't available.
Yeah.
And we're building a house now out of eucalypt and pine framing that we grew ourselves. And the prices have stayed high for those timbers. But when we planted those trees, no one in their right mind would plant pine trees for framing timber because the prices were so low. And no one would certainly grow eucalypt timbers because the government were giving away eucalypt logs for free out of the native forest. So we don't know what the future holds. So another game I play with landholders is if you're going to plant, let's talk about timber, which timber do you think are going to be more valuable in the future? And a lot of them say durable Australian hardwoods, timbers that are naturally durable or termite resistant, because we don't have to use chemicals, and people are going to be disinclined to want those timbers. You go to the hardware store now and it's full of all these, these preservative treated, chemically treated timbers. Those naturally durable timbers take a long time to grow, but gee, they're going to be valuable in the future. Nobody can tell you how much. And it's the same with the blackwood and the Australian red cedar, these valuable native timbers. They're going to be rare. I can't tell you whether I'll make any money out of them. So we grow them for some reason, and we anticipate getting that. But there is a shorter term market that's developed, even for me growing timber. It's the seed from the trees that we grow, that because other people want to now grow them. Yeah. And we sell seed of particular species directly to nurseries, but also directly to landholders who want to grow the trees we've got. And the nurseries haven't got the stock. So there is, if you're on trend, if people want to start doing or growing the trees you've got, and you're the only one who's got mature trees producing seed, you've actually got that market. And the other market that is developing is in the flowers. Some species, Banksia flowers, for example, they mightn't be for big trees for timber, but you can grow them for flowers in much shorter and get good return. After COVID, native flowers have actually gone up in price, but that might be a trend and that might pass. And there's potential for native foods. So we do grow a little bit of bush pepper and lemon myrtle and those things just for our own use now, but we'll find out which ones work and which ones we're confident, and we can expand those markets as well. But those trees will probably still be grown as understory in our wildlife corridors because they're native species, and we'll design it so we can harvest that food effectively. So there can be a range of products. I do focus on timber because it's almost the most challenging, but other landholders in our area are making good income from native flowers and other products now, which don't take the long wait before you get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And also then you've got your, I guess, your honey and or your animals that you could run underneath and all those different bits that you can plug into it. That's really cool. Yeah,
we've got 25 hives on the farm now,
okay.
from an apiarist, and he was keen to come here because it was sheltered. You had diversity of plant species. Because we grow it as a parkland, not a dense plantation, there was a lot of annuals underneath. Farmer might call them weeds, he called them beef fodder. So I have diversity in my pastures because of the tree cover. And so you've actually got those other options. Whether, I just have formed partnerships with these people so that they can manage that component rather than me adding another workload. But I like that idea of having, now we've got the sheep farmer, the apiarist, and myself, but we're looking at getting furniture makers to come in and having a range of different people working, using the property for income in different ways. And I think whereas 100 acres was never big enough to support a family from conventional agriculture, I'm hoping when you've got a mature forest, it could be at that scale where it's actually got a diversity of income streams coming in that support each other and provide some resilience. I'm not saying I'll revert to that, but I do anticipate being able to, get quite a good income from sawing and drying timber in the future, particularly once we finish the house, because people have seen the timber in the house and now they're confident that they could, if they're building locally, they're already coming to me saying, we want to use your timber. Simply whether it's because they don't want to support conventional large forestry, or they don't want their hardwood coming from native forest, or they want to use local, we've got all those outcomes. Or as fact that timber's so expensive, I might actually be the cheapest option for them anyway. So it will, and once you build up the capital asset, it could be potentially a good annual income coming from a range of different products on the farm.
Yeah, I'm a carpenter by trade, Ron. I probably should have mentioned that. So I know all about the timber prices, and you're not wrong. It's often about the money you don't have to spend. Not so much income, but money that you're not having to outlay. So that's really interesting. You mentioned workload, Rowan. I'm interested to know what a typical day for you looks like, and sort of how intense is the management of this system.
Well, right now it's just house building all the time. So it's whether it's a milling, it's a drying, or feeding the timber into the process, or just doing the building. But that's currently. But what we're harvesting now has those trees that we're harvesting. I've put in, as well as planting and protecting, as you're going to do if you're planting trees on a property, the additional work that we've had to do in order to get high quality timber is pruning and spacing the trees. And I was talking to a friend who does it now, and we were trying to put sort of a rough time figure on how much that takes to get a saw log, whether it's a eucalypt or a pine or acacia or a poplar. It's probably about half an hour to 45 minutes work over the life of the tree in order to produce a high value product that's potentially going to provide furniture or structural timber. And if you don't do that work, you've basically got firewood or pulpwood. And the difference is that we're walking through the forest, and I like to say I visit every tree every year, but I don't do anything to the more mature ones. But when they're young, and I might start pruning when they're about 4 or 5 meters tall. Maybe earlier, if there's 2 stems, I'll just take 1 stem off. So I'm always thinking about trying to produce a straight tree, and then as it grows, a straight trunk with no branches that might be 4 meters on a blackwood, 5 meters on a black walnut. It might be 6 or 7 meters on a eucalypt, or even 8 meters on a redwood. The length of it just depends on the shape and form of those trees. But I visit the tree and I climb it, or I use pole pruners to generate that clear trunk. And once you've done that work, you don't have to do it again.
Mm.
So it's about, that might take, as we said, half an hour to 45 minutes per tree that we anticipate harvesting. Some of those trees you might lose through disease or wind throw or something.
Mhm.
So roughly you might say an hour's work for every really good tree that you harvest in the future. And when you cut down a tree that's well, you cut down and mill a good eucalypt, and I know I'm getting two and a half or $3,000 worth of timber off that one log for a day's work. It seems that 1 hour I did a few years back to actually keep that as an option,
Yeah.
even if I sell the log or use it myself, it's just a good investment. And people say, well, gee, that's a lot of work. And then I think of all the other things that people have done in agriculture. Shearing a sheep, that's a lot of work. Milking a cow, that's a lot of work. There's always a little bit of carefully invested time and energy in agriculture to make something that grows produce a better product than it would if you hadn't done that.
Yeah.
And you might just call that care, or call it farming.
Totally.
It's having someone there who can just watch and then manipulate the growth so that it produces, graze it at the right time, prune it at the right time. And the difference is extraordinary. And people who suggest that we can take farmers out of the equation and have sort of automatic agriculture, or industrial forestry without a caretaker who's someone who knows the trees and manages them, I think that's what we've actually lost from forestry. We've lost the woodsman, or the woods person these days. And I really like the idea of having the woods person back in the forest, the person who cares for that forest over a period of time. The analogy I use is, when we're in East Timor running one of our farm education programs over there, a young kid rolled a bicycle tire down a wheel and tapped it with a stick. And you've probably all seen this in third world countries. The kids love playing this game. And the game is not to stand at the top of the hill and just roll that wheel down and laugh because it goes one way or the other way. The game is to run with the wheel and then take it where you want it to go. And that is the fun bit. And with forestry, we've had a history of forestry and land care plantings, conservation plantings, and production ones, where all the focus is on just planting the trees, then standing back and letting nature take its course. And nature has no course. And if we don't run with our forest, you just end up with what an accidental process of wind and disease and climate will take your forest any direction. And we have the potential to create much better forests for the reasons that we want them if we have people who are running beside their forest. And a bit of timely management, as every farmer knows, is much easier than late management and trying to correct the mistakes at the end of the game.
Yeah.
And so in forestry, you call that silviculture, the management of trees or management of forests. I guess we call it farming. And I think we need that active management in our tree growing. You need a bit of knowledge to do that. So when we run our programs for farmers, we try to teach them the fundamentals on how a tree grows, how you can manipulate the growth, how you can direct leaf area or timber growth or form and other things. And once people know that, they can look at a tree and say, either I wish I'd corrected that 10 years ago, or they can say, look at a young tree and say, if I don't just take that branch off there or that stem off there, I'm not going to have a good tree in the future. It's going to be unstable. It might fall over, or it mightn't produce a good product. So yeah, let's get people back in our forests, caring for their forests. And one of the reasons I love working with farmers, because they're close to their trees, whereas most people who work in the conservation sector or the production sector, they're miles away from the forests that they invest in. And I much rather have people close to their forests. So that's why we talk about tree growers rather than just tree planters.
Wow. What a distinction. That's bloody beautiful, Rowan. Thank you. I love that idea of running with the system. That's really cool. And it's certainly changed the way I look at my forest and the trees that I interact with on my farm since reading your book and just thinking about that as well. You don't look at a tree the same ever again. You're like, oh, just take that one off. And really cool. Hey, you have a really another profound sort of angle on things, which is the carbon debate. It's very hot right now. And I think it's one thing, I mean, with all the biodiversity credits and the carbon credits, that could be another way that farmers could obviously monetize these plantings. But you take it a bit further with the carbon debate thing. So could you just explain that a little bit for us?
Well, first of all, it's very simple science. Trees do lock up carbon. When the act of photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and the trees do that to produce effectively a very simple sugar. Now, they can do two things with that very simple sugar. They can turn it into cellulose or wood, and once it's wood, they can't eat it. They can't use it again. Or they can keep it as a simple sugar and convert it to starch, which they are able to break down and then use for growth. So you've got those two outcomes. When they use it in starch for growth, well, that gets burned off again, same way we burn energy to produce carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So the only carbon that's been locked up by trees is the carbon that's locked into woody products, cellulose and lignin, the actual wood. And we know that if you take a piece of wood, I'm holding a piece in my hand, if you can see it, it's half carbon. The actual wood is 50% carbon element. And so you can calculate exactly how much carbon dioxide was used to form that dry wood equivalent in weight. So that's the fundamentals. So what that means is every tree in every landscape, from a backyard to a hobby farm to roadside vegetation, every tree in the landscape that's locking up wood is actually locking up carbon. And the more wood they lock up, the more carbon they lock up. That's positive. On the negative side, if that wood burns or rots, that carbon is released back into the atmosphere. It's only as permanent as the wood is in that landscape. Now, if you understand how a forest grows, it does grow a lot of wood early on in its growth, but as height growth slows and competition between the trees develops, there is only so much wood that a forest can hold. So if you plant a forest, in 50 years' time, it's probably close to its maximum, and it's never going to lock up any more carbon. Some carbon trees will rot and others will grow. It'll be in balance. So if all we do is plant trees, we lock up carbon for a short time and we stop locking it up because we've done that, and we're still committed to keep it locked up. So we've got to protect it from fire, protect it from disease, protect it from drought. And we're talking about doing those things in the face of 2-degree climate change. Climate change itself is going to kill a lot of the forests that we're either planting to lock up carbon. So it's not a safe bet to go and just plant forests and think you're solving the problem, because as we're seeing in North America at the moment, in Canada, those forests are going to release a lot of carbon because of the climate change pressure. So given that, what do we do? Trees lock up carbon. You know, people talk about designing and finding new ways to lock up carbon. Well, trees do it really well. It's what we do with the wood that matters. So if we harvest the wood from our trees as they're growing, it does two things. First of all, we take that wood and we use it for a short or long-term period. We can lock up carbon for a period of time. Great if it's in buildings and furniture and lots of different buildings, because they're all not going to burn. But back in the forest, we can replace the carbon we took out with more carbon. So rather than have just a carbon sink, we can develop a carbon factory. You can lock up carbon continually if you just take some wood out of the system continually. And we can use that wood for anything over a long period of time. And effectively, it's safe from climate change because of where we've put it, where we've used it, whether it's a book in a library, whether it's a house or a piece of furniture, or whether we just stick the woody biomass back in the coal mine hole and bury it again. We're locking it up. But it's about the management of that forest. So I'm really worried about all this talk about we've just got to plant more trees to lock up carbon if we don't actively manage it, because it's not, a lot of goodwill's going into that, but we're going to see in the next 20 or 30 years a lot of dead plantings, and that goodwill is going to evaporate. So let's think about the management of that in some way. And the other point for a farmer who wants to be carbon neutral is interesting. So if you're in the livestock business, you're producing methane every year. So effectively, if you want to plant trees to lock up carbon, you've got to plant new forests every year. If your older forests have stopped locking up carbon, you've still got to hold that carbon because that methane you produced is still doing damage, although it breaks down a bit quicker than carbon dioxide. So for a farmer to be carbon neutral by planting trees, they also have to think about making sure that they continually remove some of the wood out of the system so they can grow more. Otherwise, they'll run out of land. Wow. So we've got a really positive opportunity with trees because they have a mechanism to draw carbon. It's drawdown. But we have a community that's reluctant to say, well, we're planting trees to solve the environmental problem. And they're scared, I think, to say forestry could be help this answer that question. It's forestry done very differently, of course, but it's using the fact that forestry is a tool for locking up carbon in a long-term safe environment. I'm keen to do the analysis now that we're just about finished the timber frame to work out how much carbon we've locked up in the house. And because I know that where those trees came from, I'm planting new trees, and that those trees were planted on a pasture that on a land that had no trees on it. And if I can continue harvesting off this farm, just 50 acres of trees on a 100-acre farm, I could be locking up carbon on a continual basis forever. Wow. Whereas next door, the environmental planting that's on the property next door can only lock up carbon once. And that carbon that they've locked up in that paddock is always at risk of being released in just one event, whether it's a fire, disease event. So let's, if you don't like what you see this is sort of part of my concern as I started at, a lot of people, whether they're the agriculture community or the environmental community, haven't liked the forestry that they've seen, whether it's native forest, clear felling, or it's big industrial pine plantations. I guess what I'm trying to say to them, don't reject forestry. Ask the question, how can forestry change so it can solve your problems and be beautiful? And that's the question I want people to ask, because what I'm finding, a lot of people just say, oh, I don't want to do forestry because forestry is ugly. Well, let's make forestry beautiful. Yeah, and I hope when people come to our property and some of the farms here, I've had many people come and the first thing they say is, I'm not interested in timber. I just want to grow trees for conservation or shelter. And then they get half around the farm and I think I want to grow timber, because they've never seen timber being grown in a way that they find beautiful. Wow. Whether a parkland of trees or well-spaced and well-managed trees. And they say, yeah, I can see a place for this sort of timber production on my farm. And, that's why we had to have our own farm, because I always felt that forestry could be much more attractive than the way that I was taught forestry or the way it was done by either government or industrial companies. Mm-hmm. That's not to say we shouldn't have big plantations. I'm just saying we can have much more than that, because there's all this farmland that needs trees, and they can be beautiful plantings as well.
It's really shifts the mind, gets the noggin jogging that, and it's really good. I hope so. And I don't think, I'm just thinking to myself now, I'm like, I don't think I've heard anyone else talk about this like you do, which is so interesting, given that there's so much around at the moment about carbon and planting trees and blah, 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 but no one has put it forward the way that you are doing it. And I think it's really, really important.
So that worries me to some extent, obviously.
Me too.
One thing that am I wrong? But one of the good things about doing it yourself is that you can prove to yourself it's right. If I remained an academic in an office just writing papers, well, it's easy to be discredited, but I can't be discredited when people see me cut a tree down and actually use it for something, or the farmers around the area. So that's one positive. My concern is that, take the carbon market, the advocates, they're all playing the game. they're all in it for some reason. And I'm a little bit concerned. There is a lot of money floating around, so it becomes attractive to people to support the forestry, or the green groups or the governments want to convey this notion that they're solving this crisis by planting trees. How many countries now have got 1 billion tree planting or 1 million tree planting? Or they all talk about plantings, but as I said, very few grow them.
Yeah.
And where they plant these trees, what are they actually going to, who's going to love those trees, and will they be well managed, and will they be wanted in the landscape that they're actually being planted? So that's my concern. But yeah, we need it all, but
Yes. Yes. Yes.
there is the greatest opportunity, as I come back to, is the 100,000 farming families across Australia and the millions of farmers around the world who need to utilize land to get an income to feed families or to generate a lifestyle, for whom a little bit of tree growing could be a really positive thing. I worked with the poorest farmers in East Timor and some very poor ones in Indonesia, and they still saw a value in planting a tree that might take 30 years to grow. And in East Timor, I said to them, why would you want to grow teak? You're even not sure that you haven't even got land title. You haven't got a piece of paper that says this is your land. And they said, we know it's our land. It's our cultural land. And I said, well, that's great. But how are you going to 30-year-old teak? It's going to, how are you going to live? And they said, oh, we'll keep farming. But there was great pride in being buried in a teak coffin. So they wanted to grow teak to build the houses, to have that asset, to have a lifestyle that they wanted to create for their families. And that's really the key, I think, to this long-term forestry. It's all about families. If someone's having children, so what? I mean, I've got grandchildren now and I'm still planting trees, and there's no way I'm going to see our Western Australian river Banksias being produced into a musical instrument. But I'll plant a tree for my grandchildren, that's for sure. And I'll look after it so that it can be something of value to them. So families are the key. And there's millions of them around the world that on farms making decisions every year about how they're going to utilize that land. And their land needs trees. So it's a really positive story.
It really is. And what you're saying there about the legacy piece that is there, that is missing on so many farms, Australian farms and farms around the world, is that legacy. How do we get that next generation to want to be on the farm? And what you're proposing is a real freaking solution for that. So I'm pretty excited by that. And that's actually, your work is what drove me, and the overall arching work of regenerative ag is what really got me excited about farming. Like, that was why I got to start planting trees and to doing that. And that part in your book where you made your son an English willow cricket bat. Oh man, that's the coolest thing ever.
Well, I was, the example I was thinking about was just outside the window here, just outside under cover, is a table that we planted, we grew, we harvested, we made, and now the whole family sit around it, and it's almost like and you can tell I'm getting older, but I have to reassure the young people, I did all this when I was 25 and 30. I planted these trees and worked them. It's hard to be a young tree grower harvesting trees, but it is an old man's dream to be sitting around a table that you actually planted and grew yourself. And it'll certainly feel like that when I'm in the house that we planted and grew ourselves as well. But for young people, it is exciting because and this is why I like the regenerative agricultural field, because people are now looking at opportunities to talk about, well, regeneration itself talks about enhancing and improving over time the asset. Now, we all want to make an income from that asset while we do it. And I'm not going to stand in the way of the agricultural component doing that. And also some of the potential ways that we as tree growers with young trees may be able to generate income from firewood or posts or flowers or seed and other products, or even education, being involved in groups. Our local agroforestry network, which I think is the biggest land care group in the country that people pay for, we've got almost 200 families who pay a membership. None of them actually get any free trees or fence posts. It's a very unusual land care group in that way, but we do have a lot of public money. We spend that money on paying each other to talk to each other. And now it sort of sounds a bit like a joke, but we actually have a formal mentoring program where if our leading tree growers, and some of them are quite young, can do a mentor training program, and then we will pay them to go and visit people who want to grow trees. So we've got young farmers who are tree growers now who have got good experience in establishing trees and getting started. Some of them are also sawmillers and they're getting logs from other people. And we pay them to visit other farmers to help them get started. So there is ways that a young tree grower can benefit from being a young tree grower because they can get a paid job. And these mentor jobs, some of them do a day a week or a couple of days a month or whatever. And potentially, if we've got 25 mentors working now for our network. Some of them, young ones, are actually running a field day in a couple of weeks about chainsaw maintenance and use and chainsaw milling because they're experienced and they're keen on that. So we're going to pay them to run that event. And we think that use of public money is much more effective in driving community change than if we just handed out free trees. Yes. Because once the money stops, the tree planting stops. But if you can hand out and engage people in education and networking and support, when that money stops, they're still going to talk to each other about tree growing at the local football game. Yeah. And the ones who are planting trees are still going to be encouraged and supported because they're in a community of tree growers. So while we can get public funding, we use it for education and mentoring, field days, research, or whatever we can to help farmers make more effective decisions. And I think over the period we've been going since 1993, so 30 years a tree growing group, and we've probably had about $3 million worth of funding, and that's all been invested in people. Wow. And I think that's, if you drive through this landscape, you'll actually see, well, I travel a lot in the world, and it might just be my own bias, but in this area here, when I drive 20, 30 kilometers in various directions, I see a greater diversity of tree growing on farms in this area than I see anywhere in the world. Wow. Because all the decisions have been made by the landholders about what they want to do. We help them make the best decision for them through our mentoring and education and support, which is publicly funded, but they make the decision about what they'll plant and how they'll manage it. So invariably, every planting will be different because they all want to do different things. Whereas if you have a top-down program from industry or government saying, we want you to plant this species, whether it's this indigenous species mix or it's this particular timber species, we'll only give you money if you plant it the way we think it should be grown. We have this saying in the industry at the moment, the right tree in the right place at the right scale for the right reason. I hate that because there is no right reason. It's different for every farm. But if someone thinks that, they'll employ experts to find out what is the answer, what is the right tree, and then they'll use their funding to plant that everywhere across the landscape. If it fails, as they often do, the farmers will say, it wasn't my fault, I didn't make that decision. And there'll be no learning from that decision because you haven't got all the other examples. Yes. Whereas what we find in our area, if a planting or a species fails, the landholder says, well, I only planted enough because I wanted to try it. I've just learned from that experience. And we've all learnt because we share that knowledge. And what succeeds, we share our successes. And we have that rolling wheel down the hill of cultural change in our area that drives the next planting is better than the last planting because we've all learnt from each other's experience. And so it's the culture of tree growing. Yeah. How do we invest in the culture rather than the trees? The trees will come if we have a culture of understanding and wanting and managing and caring for tree growing. You'll get as many trees as you want. So rather than a carbon program, I think governments have to invest in culture, forestry culture in our farming community, and they'll get all the trees they want for a wider range of reasons and a more resilient and useful plantings to guide. We don't know what we'll be planting in 30 or 40 years' time, but I do know in this area we'll have greater knowledge of what works by then than most other regions around the country, because we would have I've tried 70 species, other farmers have tried species I haven't. We're going to learn from that experience much faster than if you ask an expert in an office what the farmers should be planting, which is happening all around the country. So when I go to other areas, I get in a bit of trouble because I say, well, what if the expert's wrong? and let's accept that we don't know what tree is going to work.
Yes.
We don't know what markets are really going to be there in the future. Let's grow forests in an uncertain environment and in uncertain political environment, climatic environment, and commercial environment. And if you think everything's uncertain, doesn't mean you won't plant trees. You just grow them in a way to manage that uncertainty, rather than think that you get I get an email every day saying, what tree should I plant? What spacing should I put them at? And it's probably why my book's 300 pages, because there is no answer. But I think as you've picked up, it can be really exciting to learn and to try and to get on that journey as a tree growing. And that's why I wrote the book and why I did this farm, because I want people to start their journey themselves rather than let someone else take responsibility for all their decisions. Yeah. Learn from other people, but take responsibility and do what you're prepared to risk and learn from. And that can make it really exciting.
Well, Rowan, I'm bloody so glad that you wrote your book and that you've got this farm cranking the way you do, mate, because you're an inspiration to many, and obviously just it's spreading beyond the farm and throughout the area. So hats off to you, mate. And I really look forward to seeing if we can scale that method that you've just talked about there, to more land care groups and to different aspects of management as well, actually growing that culture around agriculture, because I think, like you're saying, the man or the woman or the person on the farm is what's missing nowadays, and mechanization isn't the answer. So thank you so much for joining us today, Rowan, and I really look forward to having more conversations in the future, and to getting over to Bramburgh Agroforestry Farm and checking it out for ourselves.
Yeah, thanks. We run tours quite regularly. Groups organise themselves and set up a date, or we have autumn and spring tours for the general public, and they're a lot of fun because you get people who they often come to our farm and another farm in the afternoon, our largest sheep property, and it's exciting because people, like you say, they've never seen forestry done like this before, and suddenly this world of opportunity is opening up. The challenge for me and my colleagues who work in this area is to get enough politicians and bureaucrats down here, because if they don't invest the money the right way, they will actually stifle the development of the culture, and they're going to make it worse, not better. And that's what the carbon market could do, or that's what the government projects. And it's probably why I get so passionate about it, is because it's so easy through policy decisions and public investments, to make things worse rather than better. And we've got a great opportunity to do some wonderful things with tree growing that we're not investing in. So I hope this podcast helps, and our contribution to it is useful for other people. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rowan.